Welcome to Dreamtale Sleep Stories. Tonight's reading is Two Ends of Memory. Settle into your bed or sofa and let your shoulders, jaw, and eyelids grow heavy. Inhale slowly, 1, 2, 3, and sigh the air away, allowing the day to fade into quiet dark. With every soft inhale, you invite fresh English phrases. With every gentle exhale, stray thoughts drift farther off. Behind my voice flows a gentle melody, renowned for guiding the mind toward deep relaxation. Keep your eyes closed or follow the captions, whichever feels right. Simply receive the rhythm and resonance of the language. Deep in rest, tonight's phrases will take root like seeds, ready to bloom into stronger English skills with the morning light. When you feel settled, hold that unhurried breath and allow yourself to drift into the tale. Two Ends of Memory begins now. And when the story's final line has faded, the music will linger a little longer, carrying you gently deeper into sleep. Two Ends of Memory. The first thing Haruki understood about the world was that it had a temperature. Warm was the inside of an arm, the curve of a shoulder, the milk that arrived when the crying reached a certain pitch. Cool was the wooden floor of the veranda in the early morning before the sun had come around the corner of the house. Between warm and cool, there was everything else. The wind moving the leaves of the persimmon tree, the smell of rain on stone, the sound of a bicycle bell somewhere beyond the wall. He was 6 months old. He had no words, and therefore he had no explanations. Nothing that happened to him was surprising, because he had no idea what was supposed to happen instead. This turned out to be useful in that house. His mother Yuka laid him on a folded quilt on the veranda every morning at about 9 o'clock. The veranda ran along the south side of the old house, a strip of dark polished wood between the sliding paper doors and the small garden. In summer, the light came in at a low angle and made long, bright rectangles on the floor. Haruki liked to lie in one of them and watch his own hand move above his face, opening and closing. "Stay there," his mother would say. "Just stay there for 10 minutes, please." He always stayed. He had very little choice. Beyond the veranda, inside the house, the other person lived. Haruki had learned the sound of him before he had learned the shape of him. A particular rhythm of slippers on the floor, slow, uneven, stopping often. Sometimes the sound came all the way to the veranda and stopped beside him, and then a face would appear above him, upside down, enormous, with white eyebrows and deep lines running down from the corners of the mouth. The face never looked at him the same way twice. "Whose child is this?" the old man would ask. "He is your grandson, Dad," Yuka would answer from the kitchen. "He is Haruki, my son." "Ah," the old man would say. And then, a little later, "Whose child is this?" To Yuka, each repetition was a small cut in the same place. Haruki heard something else entirely. He heard a voice that came back. In his short life, almost nothing had come back reliably except his mother. And here was a second thing, arriving again and again with the same low sound at the end of it, like a door closing gently in another room. He did not know the word for grandfather. He did not know the word for anything. But before the summer ended, he had learned to turn his head toward the sound of those slippers and to wait. His grandfather, Shiro Tanaka, was 84 years old. He had worked for 41 years at a company that no longer existed, in an office building that had been torn down and replaced by a parking lot. He had raised 2 daughters, buried 1 wife, and repaired the roof of this house 3 times with his own hands. He remembered almost none of it. Yuka had not planned any of this. Not this house, not this year, not the particular arrangement of her life, in which the 2 people who needed her most were the 2 who could tell her least. She was 38. 2 years earlier, she had been living in an apartment in the city with her husband Kenji, and a job she was reasonably good at. Then her father had been found at 11 o'clock at night, standing at a bus stop 4 kilometers from his house, waiting for a bus that had stopped running in 1998. He had been wearing his suit. He had told the police officer, politely and clearly, that he was going to work. The diagnosis came in the spring. The word the doctor used was not frightening in itself. It was the timeline that frightened her. The calm way he described what would be lost, and in what order. Her older sister, Mika, lived in Osaka. She sent money every month and telephoned every Sunday, with many opinions about the correct way to care for their father. She had visited 3 times in 2 years. So Yuka and Kenji had moved into the old house. 6 months later, Yuka was pregnant. "It is bad timing," she had said to Kenji, sitting on the edge of the bath with the test in her hand. "There is no good timing," Kenji had said. "There is only timing." She had loved him very much for that sentence, and she reminded herself of it often, especially on the days when she did not love him at all. Now her days had a shape she could not have imagined at 30. She worked at 5 to Haruki. She changed her father's bedding when it needed changing, which was 3 or 4 mornings out of 7, and she did it without comment, because the one time she had sighed, he had stood in the doorway afterwards for a long time, not looking at her, holding the doorframe. She made breakfast for a man who sometimes thanked her like a stranger in a restaurant. She fed a baby who was learning to grab the spoon. She worked 18 hours a week at a dental clinic. The strangest part, she thought, was the symmetry. Upstairs, a person who was learning everything. Downstairs, a person who was losing everything. Both of them had to be watched. Both of them put things in their mouths that were not food. Both of them cried without being able to say why. The routine began without anyone deciding on it. At some point in early July, Shiro started coming out to the veranda in the middle of the afternoon. Not in the morning, when he was usually restless and looking for his shoes, and not in the evening, when the light went orange and something in him grew anxious, and he began to ask about his mother, who had died in 1971. It was the flat, heavy part of the day, around 2 o'clock, when the cicadas were loudest and the whole town seemed to be holding still. He would slide the door open. He would look at the baby on the quilt for a while, with the particular blankness of a man reading a sign in a language he used to know. Then he would lower himself down, one hand on the doorframe and one hand on the floor, making a small sound in his throat, and sit with his back against the wooden post and his legs straight out in front of him. And then he would hum. It was always the same tune, or nearly the same. It went up and up again, and then came down more slowly than you expected, and stopped in a place that did not feel like the end. He hummed it badly, in a cracked voice, sometimes losing the middle of it and going back to the beginning. Yuka, listening from the kitchen, could not identify it. She was certain she had heard it before. Haruki did not need to identify it. For him it was not a song, it was a shape in the air, and it was reliable. And reliability was the most valuable substance in his universe. By the 3rd week he could feel it coming. When the door slid open at that hour, he stopped moving his arms and legs, and lay still. And something inside him that had no name yet arranged itself into the position of waiting. One afternoon, in the middle of the tune, Shiro put his hand down on the quilt. It was a wide hand with heavy knuckles. There was a white scar across the back of it from a roofing nail in 1979, a story he could no longer tell. Haruki reached up and took hold of the index finger. He did it the way babies do, with the whole fist, gripping with a strength that has no plan behind it. Then he pulled the finger toward his mouth, because at 6 months old the mouth was where he did his thinking. Shiro stopped humming. For 11 seconds, which Yuka counted from the kitchen doorway without meaning to, standing frozen with a wet plate in her hand. The old man looked at his own hand as though something remarkable had happened to it. He did not take the finger back. He sat there with his arm at an awkward angle and let the baby chew on it. And after a while he began to hum again, more quietly, and the tune did not lose its middle that time. Not every afternoon was like that one. Near the end of July, the heat became a physical object in the house, something you had to move through. Shiro slept badly and woke at 4 in the morning, and by the late afternoon, he was a different man from the one who had hummed on the veranda. On the 29th of July, at 4:10, he came out of his room fully dressed. He was wearing his gray suit trousers, a white shirt buttoned to the throat, and one sock. He had his wallet in his hand. "Where is my briefcase?" "Dad, sit down. It's too hot to..." The 9:40 meeting. He was already at the front door, working at the lock. His hands were shaking, but they were not weak. "They are waiting for me. Where is my briefcase?" "Dad, do you imagine I would forget the 9th floor meeting? Do you think I am a fool?" "Nobody thinks you are a fool." There is a particular helplessness in arguing with a man who is right about everything except the year. Every fact he produced was true. He had never once been late for that meeting in 41 years. Yuka stood between her father and the door with her hands out, and she could not think of a single sentence that was both kind and true. He took her wrist, not to hurt her, because he had never hurt anyone in his life, but with the grip of a man who has decided that an obstacle is going to move. His fingers went right around it. She was surprised, again, at how much strength was still in him. "Dad, let go. Get out of the way." And then, from the veranda, Haruki began to cry. He had been lying on his quilt through all of it, watching the ceiling. He did not understand a single word. What he understood was that the temperature of the voices had changed. The sound coming from the hallway was hard and fast, and had edges on it, and the person who normally held him was somewhere inside that sound. Something in his chest tightened, and then his face crumpled, and he produced the pure, rising, unignorable siren that has been keeping the human species alive for 200,000 years. Shiro let go of his daughter's wrist. He turned toward the veranda. His face changed, not into recognition exactly, but into something older than recognition, something that was still connected and still working after the rest of the wiring had come loose. "Somebody should pick that child up," he said. "Dad, you cannot leave a baby crying like that." He was already moving, pushing past her, but not toward the door anymore. He got as far as the edge of the veranda and stopped, and looked down at Haruki, and then looked at his own knees with an expression of frank betrayal. "Help me down," he said. He sat with his back against the post, in his suit trousers and one sock, and Yuka put the screaming baby into his arms, because at that moment, she could not think of any reason not to. Shiro settled him against his shoulder with a movement she had not seen him make in 30 years, and began to pat him on the back. 3 slow pats, a pause, 3 slow pats. It was a rhythm so specific and so practiced that it could only have come from a body that had done it 1,000 times in the dark. Haruki stopped crying in under a minute. Yuka went into the kitchen, turned the tap on so that the water was loud, and cried standing up, with her hand over her mouth. Kenji came home at 8:30 that night, and by 9 o'clock he had noticed the 4 faint marks on Yuka's wrist. He was not a shouting man. That was one of the reasons she had married him. He put his chopsticks down, looked at her wrist, and said, in a completely level voice, "Tell me exactly what happened." She told him. She left nothing out, because she had learned that leaving things out with Kenji cost more later. And where was Haruki? On the veranda, on the quilt, nowhere near it. This time. Kenji, no, listen to me. He still had not raised his voice. I am not angry with your father. Your father has an illness. That is not a moral question, it is a medical one. But I am asking you a practical question, and I would like a practical answer. What happens on the day he is holding the baby when it starts? She did not have an answer. I looked at the waiting lists again, he said. Aoen has a place in October, possibly. He built the roof of this house. I know. He carried me on his shoulders to the summer festival every year until I was too heavy. I know that too. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. Yuka, I am not the enemy here. There is no enemy here. That is what makes it so. He stopped and made a small, helpless gesture at the entire situation. If there were somebody to blame, we could at least be angry. They talked for another hour, in the low voices that parents learn, the voices designed to travel no further than the edge of the table. Upstairs, Haruki was not quite asleep. He could not hear the words, and even if he had heard them, he would not have known what a waiting list was, or October, or an illness. What reached him through the floor was the shape of the sound. 2 familiar voices, going back and forth, staying low, never rising to the pitch that meant danger. Low was safe. Low meant that the large people were managing something, and that it did not require him. He turned his face into the sheet, put 2 fingers in his mouth, and let go of the day. Downstairs, the 2 adults put the problem back in the middle of the table, unsolved, and agreed to look at it again next week. In the middle of August, Yuka tried the photographs. She had read that old images were sometimes still reachable, that the deep past could stay lit when the recent past had gone dark. So one afternoon at 2 o'clock, she brought out the heavy album with the brown cover and sat down on the veranda beside her father, with Haruki on the quilt between them, kicking at the hot air. Look, Dad, this is a Tommy. Do you remember a Tommy? A photograph of a young man standing on gray sand with his trousers rolled up, squinting, holding a can of beer. Shiro studied it politely. Who is that? That is you. Is it? He looked a little longer. He seems cold. She turned the page. The wedding. Her mother in a white kimono, with her chin down. Her father beside her, looking into the lens with an expression of total terror. Nothing. She turned again and again. The 2 girls in matching yellow raincoats. The roof with the ladder against it, and a man in a cap waving from the top. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Politeness, and a faint wish to be helpful, and nothing. Then she turned to a page near the middle, and stopped, because she had forgotten this one existed. It was this veranda. The same dark boards, the same wooden post, the same corner of the persimmon tree in the top right of the frame, although the tree was half the size. On a folded quilt, in a rectangle of sunlight, lay a fat baby in a white undershirt, 1 fist above her face, opening and closing. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Yuka, 8 months. Beside her, her father made a sound. Was very small, and it came from somewhere underneath speech. He put out 1 finger and touched the photograph. not on the baby, but on the wooden post, as though he had to make sure of the place first. Then he moved his finger across to the baby. "Yuka-chan," he said. Her eyes filled so fast that the garden dissolved. "Yes, Dad, that is me. That is me right here, in this exact..." But he had already turned away from the album. He was looking at the quilt. At the actual quilt, in the actual rectangle of sun, where an actual baby lay in a white undershirt, with one fist above his face, opening and closing. "Yuka-chan," he said again, and this time he was not pointing at the photograph at all. She understood then, all at once, what had been happening on this veranda every afternoon since the beginning of July. He had not been visiting his grandson. In whatever year he was living in, there was no grandson, because there was no grown daughter to have one. There was only a baby on the veranda in the summer, in the same light, under the same tree, and a man of 40-something coming out at 2 o'clock to sit with her, because his wife needed 20 minutes to herself. Time had not been erased inside her father's head. It had been folded, and the two ends had been pressed together, and by accident, they matched. She opened her mouth to correct him, and then closed it again. "Yes," she said, "that is Yuka-chan." Haruki, being called by a name that was not his, turned his head toward the voice and smiled at the old man with his whole face. Because somebody had spoken to him warmly, and at 6 months old, that was the entire test. The typhoon arrived on the 4th of September, and the power went out at 20 to 10 at night. Kenji was in Nagoya for 2 days, which is how these things arrange themselves. The house went black between one breath and the next. Outside, the wind was doing something Yuka had never heard it do before. A low, continuous pressure, with a sound inside it like a train that never arrived. Haruki, who had been asleep, was not asleep anymore. He came awake into a world in which the ceiling had been removed, and the air itself was roaring, and he did the only thing available to him. He screamed. Yuka got to him in the dark on her knees, found him, picked him up, and held him against her shoulder while she tried to think in order. Torch, kitchen drawer. Candles, the cupboard above the rice. The north shutter had not been closed because she had not finished the shutters, because there had been no time between the bath and the bottle. She could not close a shutter one-handed in that wind. "Dad," she called into the dark. "Dad, are you awake?" "Of course I am awake," said her father's voice, from much closer than she had expected, entirely calm. "The wind is up." He was standing in the corridor. In the moments when the clouds moved, she could see the shape of him, one hand flat on the wall. She had about 2 seconds in which to make the decision, and she made it with her body rather than her mind. "Sit down," she said, "here, on the floor, with your back against the wall. That is it. Now hold out your arms." And she put her screaming son into the arms of a man who could not have said what month it was. "I have to close the north shutter. 2 minutes. Do not stand up. Whatever happens, do not stand up." "Go on then," said Shiro mildly. "Go on." She went. It took closer to 5 minutes than to 2. The wind pulled the shutter out of her hands twice and drove rain into her eyes so hard that she did the last part blind, feeling for the catch. The whole time, she was listening for the crying. It stopped after about 40 seconds. When she came back along the corridor, with the torch in her teeth and her shirt stuck to her, she stopped in the doorway and did not go in. Her father was sitting exactly where she had left him, back against the wall, legs straight out in front of him. Haruki lay along his forearm and against his chest, not moving, and Shiro was patting him. 3 slow pats, a pause, 3 slow pats, and singing, not humming, singing. Words were coming out of him in a voice like a hinge, and Yuka stood in the doorway in her wet clothes and heard the middle of the tune completed for the first time in 2 months. She knew it. Of course she knew it. It had been sung directly into her own ear in this house before she had any way of storing it as a memory. The man could not remember his own face in a photograph on a beach. He could not remember that his wife had died, but his hands remembered the three-pat rhythm, and his throat remembered every word of a lullaby, and the wind could take the roof off for all he cared, because he was busy. When she came back with the candles 10 minutes later, both of them were asleep, sitting upright in the corridor, with the storm going over the house. Autumn came, and with it the paperwork. A woman from the city office visited on a Tuesday, and sat at the low table for 90 minutes with a clipboard, asking Shiro questions in a bright, careful voice. What is the date today? Who is the Prime Minister? Please remember these 3 words, I will ask you again later. He was pleasant throughout, and offered her tea 4 times. Near the end he asked her, twice, whose child was crawling about on the veranda, and each time she wrote something down without changing her expression, and Yuka watched her write it and understood that this was the part that counted. The letter came 11 days later. The assessment had gone up a level, and Aoyen, the small care home 8 minutes away on the bicycle, had a room available from the 20th of October. Mika telephoned that Sunday, as always. Well, obviously, you take it, she said. Yuka, you cannot possibly be thinking about it. I am thinking about it. You have a baby and a father and a part-time job, and you have not slept properly in a year. There is no version of this in which you keep going. Dad would be the first person to say so. A pause. The old dad, I mean. That was the sentence that stayed with her all week. The old dad. As though there had been a clean edge, a single day when one man had stopped and another had started, instead of what had actually happened, which was a slow tide going out over 2 years, leaving more of the seafloor visible every month. Meanwhile, Haruki was busy in the opposite direction. At 7 months he learned to sit up by himself, wobbling, both hands flat on the quilt, like a man steadying a boat. At 8 months, he discovered that if he pushed with his knees and pulled with his arms, he could travel. Yuka found that she was keeping 2 sets of notes, without having meant to. In one, the things her son could do this month that he could not do last month. In the other, the things her father could do last month that he could not do this month. The notebooks were the same size, the handwriting was the same. Only the direction of travel was different, and some evenings, with both of them open on the table, she had the strong and useless thought that the 2 lists ought to be able to cancel each other out somehow. There was not. That is not how any of it works. On the 11th of October, she cycled to Aoyen and looked at the room. It had a window facing south, and a low bed, and a garden with a bench in it. The manager was a heavy, slow-moving man of about 60, who used her father's name every time, correctly, and at the end said, "You do understand that bringing him here is not the same as giving him away." "I know," she said. "Most people know it," he said. "Very few people believe it. It takes about 3 months." She signed the forms on the 14th. The 19th of October was warm and completely still. The persimmons on the tree had gone orange, and 2 of them had split. Yuka had done the packing that morning. 3 sets of clothes, his razor, 4 towels, the photograph of her mother in the small silver frame, and the brown album, which the manager at Aoyen had specifically asked her to bring. At 2 o'clock she made tea and carried it out to the veranda and sat down. She had found out about the song in September. She had typed the few words she could make out into her telephone at midnight, about 8 of them, and after a while, she had found it. An old lullaby from the mountains in the north, from the district where her father had been born. A song about a boat and a bird and somebody coming back down the river in the morning. It had never been popular. It had been sung in kitchens, which meant that her father had learned it from his own mother, who had died in 1971, and for whom he still occasionally waited by the front door in the evenings. It meant that the song had been in this house the whole time, traveling quietly downwards through people, surviving in the one part of a man that the illness had not been able to reach. The door slid open. "Ah," said Shiro, "you are out here. I am out here. Sit down, Dad, there is tea." He lowered himself onto the boards in the usual way, one hand on the frame and one hand on the floor, with the usual small sound. Then he looked around the veranda with mild interest and found what he was looking for. Haruki was already coming. He had a system now. He led with the right arm, dragged the left knee, paused to check his direction, and repeated. He arrived at his grandfather's leg, used the gray trousers to pull himself up into a sitting position against it, and breathed hard, extremely pleased with himself. "Well," said Shiro. "Well, well." Yuka put her cup down. Then she sang. She had not sung anything out loud since she was a schoolgirl, and she was aware, immediately, of how thin her voice was in the open air. She sang the first line the way she had heard it in the corridor during the typhoon, with the words in the wrong places, and the tune going up and coming down more slowly than you expected. Her father turned his head. For a moment there was nothing in his face at all. Then he came in underneath her, half a beat late, in that cracked hinge of a voice, and he had all of the words, and she had none of them. And he carried the line through to the end, and did not lose the middle. They went through it 3 times. The second time she got most of the words. The third time she stopped singing altogether, and simply listened to him. And in the pause afterwards, while the cicadas were doing the last of their work for the year, a small voice on the boards between them said roughly and wetly and with enormous effort, "Ah, da, ah." It was not a word. Yuka knew that. It was a shape going up and coming down more slowly than you expected. Shiro looked down at the baby holding onto his trouser leg. "That is right," he said. "That is more or less it." They moved him on the 20th of October, and the cruelest part of the whole business was how easy it was. He came out to the car in his good jacket, in good spirits, having been told that he was going somewhere for a while, and he did not ask where or why. He was interested in the weather. He complimented Kenji on the car, which Kenji had owned for 9 years. At the door of Aoyen, he shook the manager's hand like a man arriving at a hotel, and said that he had heard good things about the place, which was not possible. Yuka had prepared herself for a scene in the entrance hall, her father in the doorway, understanding, turning round, asking her why. He did not turn round. He went in and asked whether there was a bath. She sat in the passenger seat in the car park afterwards and cried in the loud, undignified way she had not allowed herself for 2 years, while Kenji held the back of her neck and said nothing at all, which was the correct thing. They went 3 times a week after that, Tuesday, Friday, Sunday. 8 minutes on the bicycle, with Haruki strapped into the seat behind her, shouting at dogs. Her father's room faced south. In the afternoons the sun came in across the floor in a long, bright rectangle, and the staff had worked out within about 10 days that her father was calmest between 1 and 3 o'clock if you put a cushion on the floor in the sunlight. So that is where they found him, most visits. In December, Haruki learned to walk, 4 steps, then 11, then the whole room. He was 13 months old and had the unstable dignity of a small drunk. He had 4 words, Mama, Papa, Wan Wan for any animal whatsoever, and a 4th that Yuka wrote in the notebook and underlined because she could not prove it and did not care. On a Sunday afternoon in January, Yuka sat on the edge of her father's bed with her coat still on and watched her son cross the sunlit floor on his own feet. Shiro was on the cushion with his back against the wall and his legs straight out in front of him. He had a blanket over his knees. He had said very little that month. Some days he did not speak at all. And the staff had begun using words like gradually and what we might expect, in their gentle professional way. And Yuka had learned to hear them without flinching. Haruki arrived, put a hand on each of his grandfather's knees, and climbed into his lap without asking anyone for permission. The old man's arms came up around him. They did it by themselves, the way they always had. Then Shiro raised his head and looked at his daughter across the sunlit room with perfectly clear eyes, and asked her the question he had been asking her for 2.5 years. Whose child is this? Yuka did not correct him this time either. There was nothing left to correct. Yours, she said. He is yours, Dad. Ah, said Shiro. Yes. He began very quietly to hum. The tune went up and up again, and came down more slowly than you expected, and stopped in a place that did not feel like the end, and then started once more from the beginning. Haruki settled his head against the old gray cardigan and let his eyes close. He did not know the word for grandfather, or for illness, or for the way the afternoon light moves along a wooden floor in winter. He did not know that the person holding him could not remember his name, or that he himself would never remember any of this. He knew that the sound was coming back again. He knew that the wool smelled of soap and tea and something dusty and particular that existed nowhere else in the world. And he knew, with the whole of his small and complete understanding, that where he was now was warm.